The monarchy was not shaken by a sudden uprising, a scandalous headline, or a public rebellion. It was shaken by a single sealed message placed before Princess Anne, carrying the weight of a king's final unwavering wish. When she broke the seal, the room at Windsor fell into a silence that no royal aid could soften and no protocol could bridge. In that moment, Prince William and Catherine were no longer just the future of a 1,000-year-old institution. They were the answer Charles had already chosen long before the world was ready to ask the question. There was no ceremony, no cheering crowd, and no televised announcement. Only a pen awaiting a constitutional file and a decision concerning Prince William that could no longer be delayed. Behind a locked door at Buckingham Palace, senior courtiers were ordered to surrender their phones and led into a restricted chamber. The king arrived carrying a folder marked for sovereign access only. Inside lay the Royal Continuity Declaration. This was not a document of sentiment. It was a cold mechanism of power. Charles knew that the monarchy survived only key the next step was secured before danger arrived. He looked at the signature line, a father pushing his son toward a burden no father could ever truly soften. For seconds, he did nothing. His hand hovered over the parchment, the gold nib of his pen catching the dim light of the study. Then, with a definitive stroke, the king wrote his name. At that exact moment, miles away, William felt the shock before he knew its cause. A discreet message asked him to return to Windsor, immediately offering no explanation. Catherine watched his face change, the quiet normalcy of their afternoon at Adelaide Cottage evaporating in a single glance. He folded the small slip of paper, his knuckles white. "Something has happened," he whispered. He wasn't afraid of the throne. He was afraid of the loss that had to come before it. The secret declaration carried a confidential schedule showing which briefings, state papers, and constitutional responsibilities would begin moving toward the future king immediately. This was not symbolic. Charles had built a mechanism capable of accelerating the transition without public warning. It was the ultimate paradox, a father's act of protection, that simultaneously signaled the beginning of his own institutional end. The catalyst for this radical move was a terrifying weakness exposed during the Commonwealth service at Westminster Abbey. To the public, the event appeared dignified, a sea of silk hats and military medals. But behind the scenes, the machinery of the state had seized. An urgent state communication involving national security arrived, while Charles was temporarily unavailable, locked into a ceremonial sequence that could not be broken. Because the deepest powers remained concentrated solely in the sovereign officials, needed an immediate answer that no one else was authorized to give. William stood in a private antechamber, listening to aides argue in frantic whispers beyond the door. For 11 minutes, the British government was paralyzed. The heir to the throne stood ready, a man in his prime, yet the system treated him as a spectator. When Charles returned and realized the damage, the 11-minute vacuum where the crown had no voice, he didn't just apologize to his son. He changed the law of his house. Anne had studied that 11-minute failure in silence. Known as the steel of the family, she entered Charles's office with a written timeline of the delay and placed it on his desk. She told him that loyalty to William required more than shielding him from fear. It required preparing him completely. Affection, she warned, becomes dangerous when it prevents the heir from receiving the authority he needs to act. Anne had supported the declaration's strongest clause, that whenever national continuity was at risk, William must receive the same emergency briefings as the sovereign. Charles accused her of forcing the future too close, his voice echoing in the vast, quiet office. But Anne did not flinch. She understood that a royal wish is sentimental until the machinery behind it begins to move. She reminded him that the crown is a living thing, and it does not wait for a heart to be ready. When William finally discovered the declaration, he did not thank his father for securing his future. He demanded to know why it had been done in secrecy. In a private sitting room at Windsor, the future king placed the document on the table between them. He had spent his adult life accepting his destiny, but he believed that any meaningful transition should involve him as a partner, not arrive as a completed decision handed down from a sovereign. Charles saw secrecy as protection, a way to prevent the public from thinking he was preparing to surrender the crown. But William saw only a lack of trust. "Did you sign this because the institution needs me?" William asked. "Or because you believe you may not be able to continue?" The question hung in the air, sharper than any blade. The room fell silent, as Charles admitted that Westminster had frightened him. He had seen the monarchy trapped between an unavailable sovereign and an heir forbidden to act. He refused to let that weakness survive. But the revelation went deeper. Charles hadn't designed the strongest provisions alone. The Lord Chamberlain and constitutional advisers had pressed for a continuity instrument, a way to ensure that authority functioned during illness, absence, or crisis. Camilla too felt the shift. Every official who looked toward William during a briefing seemed to confirm that the old balance was moving. She was fiercely protective of Charles's reign, yet she saw the necessity of Anne's warning. For Camilla, the new order carried a quiet, visceral pain. Every step toward the prince felt like one step away from the husband she had fought a lifetime to be beside. The declaration was never announced yet. The palace began behaving as if it had been. William's private office received new security clearances overnight. Red boxes, the secure cases used for confidential state papers, began arriving for the prince in full rather than in shortened summaries. Catherine saw the revised schedule and felt the sorrow of duty tightening its grip. She knew that public-facing authority meant that every charity visit and every gesture of calm would no longer be seen as support for William, but as part of the monarchy's survival plan. "Responsibility does not require emotional isolation," she told him. Even as she saw how the weight of millions of lives began to change the man she loved. She watched him pore over the cabinet office briefings until the early hours, the glow of his desk lamp the only light in the house. The future wasn't coming. It was already sitting at their kitchen table. The true turning point, however, occurred not in a briefing room, but during a private walk in the Windsor grounds. William removed every institutional barrier, asking for a walk with no aides and no folders. He asked Charles what he had felt when Queen Elizabeth began preparing him for kingship. Charles stopped, his breath misting in the cold air, and admitted a truth he had never spoken, that guilt had followed every lesson. Each briefing prepared him for a future that required his mother to be gone. William confessed the same, that every new folder and added responsibility felt like a farewell. In that moment, the king and the heir disappeared, leaving only a father and a son standing on the damp grass. Charles placed a hand on his son's shoulder. He hadn't written the wish to erase himself. He had written it to ensure that William was never left unprotected in the vacuum of power. By morning, the secret no longer belonged to Windsor. A confidential summary escaped palace control, and Britain awakened to a national shockwave. Broadcasters abandoned their schedules. The public was told that Charles had formally prepared William for the next reign, but the deeper meaning remained uncertain. Was this a hidden warning about the king's health or responsible continuity? Buckingham Palace responded with a statement that walked a razor's edge, praising continuity and Charles's confidence in the prince and princess. It was not an abdication, but it was the clearest acknowledgement yet that the future had entered the present. The headlines were relentless, but inside the palace there was a strange new calm. The truth was out, and the fear of the secret was gone. The country needed to see unity, and the palace delivered. When Charles and William finally appeared together at a national service, the arrangement carried a clear message. Charles stood in the leading position, But William walked beside him, not behind him. The monarch still held full authority, yet the future king was being prepared openly. Charles paused before they stepped forward, adjusting William's ceremonial insignia, a small, fatherly gesture that the cameras caught and the world analyzed. "You are ready to learn what no one can learn alone," Charles whispered. William answered, "Then we do it together." The secret document had ceased to represent fear. It had become proof that the crown had chosen preparation over denial. Charles's signature was not an ending. It was a father's protection. The monarchy survived because it did not deny that change would come. It met that change with honesty and discipline. Succession, they realized, is not just the passing of a throne from one man to another. It is the endurance of a promise. Catherine stood as the steadiness Charles had predicted, and William accepted the burden without surrendering his heart. As the sun set over the long walk at Windsor, the silence of the palace was no longer heavy with secrets. The secret declaration had done its work. It had forced the family to face the brutal machinery of the monarchy and come out united. Trust, steadiness, and partnership had shown the way forward. The crown would survive not because tradition alone demanded it, but because those who wore it were ready to carry it together. The king remained sovereign, the prince remained the heir, but the weight was now shared. And in that shared burden, the British monarchy found its newest and perhaps its strongest heartbeat. There was no more mystery, only the unmistakable truth that the king's final wish had not divided the house. It had secured it. In the high-stakes theatre of royal survival, Charles had played his most difficult hand, and in doing so, he had ensured that when the time eventually comes for the crown to pass, it will not be a moment of chaos, but a moment of absolute unwavering clarity. The complexity of the royal transition began to manifest in the smallest details of palace life. Behind the scenes, the Transition Council, a group so small its existence was barely whispered, began meeting in the 1844 room. This wasn't a council of elders, but a task force of strategy. William chaired these sessions, his voice growing more confident with each passing week. He wasn't just learning protocol, he was learning the delicate art of constitutional diplomacy. He was reviewing the golden triangle, the relationship between the palace, the cabinet office, and the home office. Catherine attended the sessions related to the Duchy of Cornwall, her focus shifting toward the vast estate's social impact. They were no longer the glamorous couple on the balcony. They were the executives of an ancient corporation undergoing a massive restructure. But with this new power came a profound sense of isolation. William found that senior courtiers who had known him since childhood now treated him with a newfound, slightly fearful deference. The casual conversations in the hallways stopped. When he entered a room, the air changed. This is the loneliness of command that his grandmother had once spoken of. He found himself spending more time in the archives reading the private letters of George VI, seeking advice from a king who had also been thrust into a role he hadn't sought. He realized that the crown doesn't just sit on your head, it sits on your soul. It changes how you see your friends, your family, and even yourself. He was no longer just William, he was the living future. Camilla's role in this new landscape was perhaps the most nuanced. She became the bridge between the king's desire to remain relevant and the prince's need to be prepared. She saw the moments when Charles felt diminished by William's rising influence, and she was the one who quietly reminded the staff that the king's word was still final. She wasn't fighting for power, she was fighting for her husband's dignity. She understood that for Charles, the declaration was a form of mortality, a recognition that his time was finite. In the evenings away from the red boxes and the briefings, she would walk with him in the gardens of Highgrove, steering the conversation away from the state and back to the soil, the trees, and the things that don't change with a signature. Anne, meanwhile, became the enforcer of the transition. She had no patience for the internal politics, or the bruised egos. If a briefing was late, she was the one who made the call. If a courtier was playing both sides, she was the one who ended their career. She was the guardian of the unmissable truth. She knew that the public's perception of the monarchy depended on its appearance of stability. Any hint of a rift between Charles and William would be fatal. She coached William on the Anne method, how to be direct without being divisive, how to lead without appearing to push. She was the one who reminded him that the crown is a relay race, and the most dangerous moment is the handoff. The public reveal of the declaration had a secondary effect. It forced the Commonwealth to look at William with new eyes. Leaders from around the world began reaching out, not just for ceremonial visits, but for substantive discussions. The William era had begun in the minds of the global community before it had officially started in London. He found himself on calls with prime ministers and presidents discussing climate change, global security, and the future of the Commonwealth. He was no longer just a representative, he was a player. Catherine too saw her profile rise. Her work on early childhood development was now seen through a constitutional lens as a long-term investment in the nation's social fabric. They were building a legacy that wasn't just about the throne, but about the people. Yet the emotional cost remained. At George's 10th birthday, William looked at his son and felt a sudden sharp pang of realization. George was now the age William was when the world began to feel heavy. He realized that by accepting this secret declaration, he was also accelerating George's eventual burden. The cycle was repeating. He took George for a walk much like the walk he had taken with Charles, and they talked about nothing in particular. Football schooled the dogs. He wanted to give George the one thing the declaration had taken from him: time. He made a silent vow that while he would be ready to lead the nation, he would always be there to protect his children from the machinery for as long as possible. The final verdict of the secret declaration wasn't found in a law book or a news report. It was found in the quiet understanding that had settled over the royal family. They had faced the shattering, the moment when the secrets were revealed and the egos were bruised, and they had stayed together. The 11-minute failure at Westminster was now a distant memory, replaced by a system that was robust, transparent, and united. Charles had found a way to be a king and a father. William had found a way to be a prince and a partner. And the monarchy had found a way to survive the 21st century. As the palace prepared for the next state opening of Parliament, the atmosphere was different. There was no tension, only a sense of shared purpose. William and Catherine were at the heart of the planning, their influence woven into every aspect of the ceremony. Charles looked at them and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since his coronation. He had done his duty. He had secured the future. He had protected his son. The secret declaration was no longer a secret. It was the foundation of a new era. The crown was steady. The future was bright. And for the first time in a very long time, the House of Windsor was not just surviving, it was thriving. The king had spoken. The future had answered. And the story was just beginning. The transition also meant a change in the physical geography of the palace. William's office was moved closer to the king's, a symbolic shortening of the distance between the present and the future. The two offices began to function as a single unit, with information flowing freely between them. This unified household was a radical departure from the siloed offices of the past. It reduced the friction and the competition that had often plagued royal transitions. It was a model of modern management applied to an ancient institution. Catherine's team too was integrated into the senior communications strategy, ensuring that her voice was consistent with the king's vision for the monarchy's role in society. In the final assessment, the king's secret declaration was a masterpiece of strategic foresight. It acknowledged the reality of age and the necessity of youth without creating a conflict between the two. It turned the transition from a frightening event into a manageable process. It allowed Charles to reign with the confidence that his legacy was secure, and it allowed William to prepare with the confidence that he was trusted. The monarchy did not break under the weight of the revelation. It became more flexible. It showed that even an institution built on tradition can innovate when its survival is at stake. The pen had not just signed a document, it had signed a guarantee. And as Britain looked toward the future, it saw a crown that was not a relic of the past, but a beacon for the years to come. The king remained on the throne, the prince remained by his side, and the people remained the center of their shared devotion. The story of the secret declaration was the story of a family choosing to be great together.